for our virtual event. It was Tuesday night. We've been doing lots of Mondays and Thursdays, but we're doing a little bit different tonight. We're thrilled to have you all here joining us. We've been, gosh, I think we've done 30, 40 of these virtual events the last few months, and we've had all kinds of fun, interesting people, you know, fiction, nonfiction, all over the place. And we plan to do a lot more. So I hope you will stay tuned on our website. We have basically 2 or if not 3 events happening weekly. And almost all of them are free and open to the public. And like I said, lots of different topics, some really compelling stuff. We have, you know, everything from, you know, some great young novelists coming up. We're doing some events around corruption. We're doing some things around race and identity. We have an event coming up. And I'm looking at the history of the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, there's some really interesting topical stuff happening over the next couple of months, but also some things like John Waters, which would be really fun, and talking to, all kinds of, you know, interesting people. The comedian Mike Birbiglia. So it's kind of all over the place, which is nice. You know, when we have the bookstore open, one of the things we're most proud of is offering a really nice variety to our audience, and that's what we're going to try to keep doing here. I couldn't be more thrilled to have Tom Clavin joining us in some ways for a second time. We had Tom here for his Dodge City book a couple of years back, and we did a really fun event over at the Circle Cinema, and then we showed film, and strangely enough, the film we showed was Tombstone, which is a great lead in to tonight for the book we'll be talking about tonight of the same name. So Tom is joining us live from Sag Harbor, New York, and we couldn't be more thrilled to have him. Welcome back in virtual way to Tulsa, Tom.
Thank you for having me back. I remember very fondly being at the cinema, and what a great venue, you know, to be able to combine giving a talk about something and then a similarly themed movie to show.
Yeah,
that was fun.
Yeah, remember movie theaters, everybody? Yeah, that was fun. I do want to say before we really start diving into the conversation, we're going to have some links here. If you look at the chat, we'll be posting links to buy a copy of Tombstone. I would encourage you to do that. It's just a hell of a fun read, and you learn a lot. And it's you know, I think we know things about this, and that this is one of those great opportunities to really expand on the little bits and pieces that you've heard over the years or watched on television or seen in a film. So anyway, let's get to it. So the last time we spoke, we were talking Dodge City.
Right.
And of course, we were talking Wyatt Earp, and that has continued here. So it seems like the natural evolution of this project, but you're spending years of your life hanging out with Wyatt Earp. Did you kind of know that this was going to be a multi-book project, you know, back then?
No, not at all. In fact, when I started work on Dodge City, it was probably 2015, I'm going to say, because the book was published in hardcover originally in February of 2017. And if I knew at that time that I was embarking on a trilogy, that I would be spending 5 years on a trilogy, that when you put the 3 books together, you're talking about over 1,000 pages of material. I don't know that it might have been too daunting to get going on that. That was not my intention at all. I had done Dodge City as a one-shot deal. It was Bat Masterson, Wyatt Earp, Dodge City, 1875 to 1879. Very focused on that particular period in their lives and that particular period in the American West frontier. And in fact, when that book was done and turned in, and the production process was well underway, and I had more free time to do this, I had pitched an idea to my editor about a very different kind of story for my next book. And then what happened is I went on the Dodge City book tour, because it came out, like I say, in February, and I was making the rounds of the book tour, which was very, very enjoyable. And while I was on the book tour, I remember very specifically, I was in Wichita. I had just landed, the plane had just landed in Wichita, because I was going to go to Watermark Books, which is also a wonderful bookstore.
Yes.
And I got a call from my editor saying it was the first week out of the gate, it was on the New York Times bestseller list, Dodge City. And it got on other bestseller lists and stayed on bestseller lists. So when I got back to see my editor again after the book tour, he said, well, we should do one more. People are asking, bookstores are asking, do one more about an iconic American West figure that may not have gotten the kind of attention book-wise that he deserves. And that turned out to be Wild Bill. And so Wild Bill comes out in February 2019, And that does well, and it's well reviewed, and it sells very well. And we realized that we had a trilogy here. We had, even though we were sort of out of sequence chronologically, Wild Bill comes first because it mostly deals with Bill Hickok from the end of the Civil War to his death in 1876. Then chronologically have Dodge City. But we said, what we actually have here is like a frontier lawman trilogy. Wild Bill is the lone gunman, I'm going to kill you before you kill me way of policing. Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson with a more, let's say, advanced way of keeping the peace than just let's kill them faster than they kill us. And then you had Wyatt Earp when he left. He teamed up with his brothers in Tombstone. And in fact, at the gunfight at the OK Corral, which was in October 1881, Virgil Earp, who was the only actual real lawman that day in that event, was at his official title. He was the commissioner of the police department. So we started to see the frontier start to close up and police departments take the place of some sheriff's offices and marshal's offices. So there was like an arc to the frontier lawmen. And so it just seemed like, we're on this momentum. Let's look at Tombstone and sort of close the arc of that story. So that's how it came about. To go back to the original question, I think I don't know if I would have had the courage back in 2015 to say, sure, I can write 3 books of over 1,000 pages total about the American frontier.
And that's 1,000 edited pages, not what it started even out to be, of course.
Yes.
One of the things I loved speaking with you about, and about the Dodge City book, we spent some fairly good time talking about. Mm-hmm. I think most people don't realize, Wyatt Earp lived well into the 20th century. He died the same year of the crash on Wall Street in 1929. He had this kind of whole second or third act, I guess, rather, in this kind of more modern world, but we think of him kind of frozen in amber in this one or two places, right? One being Tombstone, the other being Dodge City. And so I was interested in kind of learning more about him, but now that you've kind of gone back to that moment that we kind of, I think that OK Corral moment, that Tombstone moment, when you kind of sat down to start this project, was the biggest, were you daunted by, what can I say that's new here? Did you already know there was some new stuff there going into the project?
That for Tombstone, that was more of a challenge than it was for Dodge City and Wild Bill. In the case of Wild Bill, not that he's never been portrayed before in a book, certainly has been in the movies, but really the last full-scale biography of Wild Bill Hickok was by Joseph Rosa in 1964, and who did a lot of research. He really was the man when it came to Wild Bill Hickok until, when his book came out in 1964. But there was so much that has been come to light since then, and Wild Bill is one of those figures, I think, that immediate name recognition, but who was he really? He often gets confused with Buffalo Bill. Wild Bill, Buffalo, which was which? Like Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone, which was which?
Right.
So, and with Dodge City, I think that that story of the friendship and the side-by-side, I've got your back, you've got my back, lawman practices of Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson had not really been done before, or done at least to the extent that I felt like I did it with a 400-something page book, especially Bat Masterson. Who, again, name recognition, but who was he a gunfighter? Was he a gambler? Was he an explorer? Who was Bat Masterson? But that was more of a challenge with Tombstone. It's a more, I think most people see it as a more familiar story. Film-wise, it's had, you mentioned a film called Tombstone with Kurt Russell and Sam Elliott and others, Bill Pullman and Val Kilmer. But you go back decades to when John Ford did it in My Darling Clementine, and you go back to the film actually called Gunfight at the OK Corral with Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas. You have the movie Wyatt Earp, which is mostly Tombstone, the one with Kevin Costner. So there was more of a challenge. What could be told about the story that you didn't already see on screen, particularly? Or in a book like, there's a very, very good book called The Last Gunfight. You're probably familiar with it, by Jeff Gwynne.
Yeah.
And that's a very good book. And wasn't trying to duplicate what Jeff Gwynne had done with that book. But I thought, in addition to wanting to complete the trilogy as a motivation, I think my thought was, let me go back as much as possible to contemporaneous sources, to the eyewitness accounts. Maybe I would focus a bit more on the brothers' relationship, because this was a really an ambitious and promising moment for the Earp family. All five brothers got together in Tombstone. It wasn't just Wyatt Earp, but 5 brothers. And this was their opportunity to really put a stamp on the American frontier and become successful businessmen. And there were other aspects of it. I think also, too, wanting to give a little more attention to the vendetta ride, because in most stories, certainly on the big screen, when the gunfight, the OK Corral is over, cue the credits and the music. There's nothing after that that's worth showing, which was not the truth. I mean, after the gunfight, the OK Corral, there was a month-long trial of Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday for murder. And then you had the vendetta ride, where Doc and Wyatt and Warren Earp, another brother, and several of their cohorts take off as a sort of like a semi-legal posse to track down the guys who had shot Wyatt's brother. So yes, with Tombstone, more of a challenge than Dodge City and Wild Bill, to try and make it more revelatory and less familiar, or what people think they know about the story.
So one of the things that I think you do so well with these books specifically is, the West is so tied up in myth and urban myth and apocryphal stories and all these things. And I think in some ways, those are the things we love, right? And so there's the fear that if we poke too many holes in the legend, that all the kind of intrigue and interest kind of drains out of it. But I think what you show is that by knowing more and by straightening out the story, you kind of see, the whole picture in a much more broad and interesting way. It only enhances the legend, I guess, in a way.
Well, I think it makes the legend more interesting, because if you see them, yes, they're a legend. Wyatt Earp is a legend. Doc Holliday is a legendary figure. You could say Virgil Earp is a legendary figure. They're not nearly at the same level as Doc and Wyatt. Bat Masterson is a legendary figure. But I think if you also get to know them a little better, too, as real people, and what their challenges were, what their love interests, what their habits were. I mean, Wyatt Earp couldn't drink. Who knew? Wyatt Earp, you see him portrayed as somebody who bellied up to the bar with the best of them, could knock back a couple of shots of whiskey. He couldn't tolerate alcohol. I think that's an interesting little factoid about Wyatt Earp that humanizes him a little bit more. I think when you have the story of Tombstone is where Wyatt Earp fell in love. It was kind of messy that it was with the sheriff's fiance, but love takes its own directions. And Wyatt Earp had been married before, in fact, 3 times. But this woman he fell in love with, they were together for the next 45 years. I think he finally got it right. So I think if you humanize these legends, I think it just makes for a better story. Otherwise you're just reading the same stuff that, like the dime store novelists have been doing since the 1860s.
So when you started on this book, having written the Dodge City book, were you at an advantage because you had a base knowledge? Meaning, if this had been your first book on the Earps, would it have been a much harder book to write? Because you had kind of done a lot of not all of it, but a lot of the work had been done and you knew where to go for the resources. Did that help grease the wheels a little bit for you process-wise?
Yeah, definitely. It's a good question, because it would have been a bigger hurdle to write Tombstone if I was writing that as a standalone book and I was starting that from scratch. That's the situation Dodge City was in. I started that from scratch. That was supposed to, like I said before, it was supposed to be a standalone book. But having done Dodge City, having done Wild Bill, even though to some extent we're talking about some different characters, there are some crossovers, and you're talking about different places and times. I mean, Wild Bill, his biggest role as a lawman was as the marshal of Abilene, Kansas, in 1870 and 71. But yes, I had accumulated a lot of information, and not all of it made it into Dodge City, and it just basically got filed away. And then when I did Wild Bill, the same thing. Some of it I couldn't use everything; it got filed away. But when I did Tombstone, there were a couple of things I could do. One, I had material I'd already collected, so I wasn't starting from scratch. The other thing is I can make references to the two previous books. I don't have to tell Bat Masterson's story again. And by the way, Bat Masterson's a character in Tombstone because he was there too. He would have been in a gunfight at the OK Corral if circumstances had worked out differently. And so I could reference Bat Masterson and his life as portrayed in Dodge City without having to repeat it all again. Now, okay, somebody could say, well, I'm not going to read the whole trilogy. I don't like Clavin that much. But I think that a lot of people who have read one of these books may end up reading two of them or possibly all three. Yeah. And so rather than keep repeating the same stuff in Tombstone, I'll make some references to Wild Bill, but especially Dodge City.
A couple of questions from our viewers here. One is from a person named Marcus Sippy, S-I-P-P-Y, and he says, "My name is Marcus Sippy. Growing up, we were always told we were related to Tombstone's sheriff, Ben Sippy. It wasn't until getting older that we found out he actually played a part in the Tombstone story. Do you know what happened to him after fleeing Tombstone?"
No, I put into the book that, I suppose if somebody really wanted to make it a mission, you could track down Ben Sippy, whatever happened to him. But he was the marshal of Tombstone. He had actually defeated, the previous year, Virgil Earp was temporarily the marshal of Tombstone after the marshal had been killed by Curly Bill Brocius. And when the time came to run for election, which I believe was probably November of 1880, Virgil ran for re-election, but he was defeated by Ben Sippy. And I'm not aware that any Ben Sippy did a bad job. But what seemed to happen, well, actually there were some rumors that there was some public funds, misplaced, let's say. But in the case of Ben Sippy, he also realized that there was an increasing amount of tension between the cowboy and rancher faction and the law and order faction in Tombstone. And he was going to be right in the middle. He didn't have to be the only one right in the middle because Cochise County had a sheriff, Johnny Behan. But Johnny Behan was not one who was going to take on the cowboys. If anything, he was a fellow traveler with the cowboys and the ranchers. So I think Ben Sippy, the following June, saw the writing on the wall and said, you know what, if this breaks into violence, my life's not going to be worth very much. Basically, he told the city council, I'm going away for a bit. I need a little vacation. He boarded a train. It was reportedly heading east. And that was the last anybody saw or heard of Ben Sippy.
Another question is, how common were gunfights in the West? Meaning, was this something that was happening a lot, or was this something that's been just blown out of proportion by movies, TV, and books?
Well, to answer the second question first, yes, there's a certain amount of being blown out of proportion. When you consider all the Westerns that were made in the movies, for example, that have featured gunfights, it's a number anybody was still alive west of the Missouri, except maybe women and children. So it was blown out of proportion because, while many people carried guns, a lot of people did not use guns or did not intend to use guns. They were simply, if you were a cowboy, you used a gun because sometimes you used it to prod the cattle along. People would use guns maybe if they were living on the frontier and were afraid of Indian raids. Most people didn't wear guns because they wanted to get into duels with other people. They just weren't going to go there. It's not the kind of person they were. They were farmers. They were ranchers. They owned dry goods stores. They worked for the post office. They were school marms, whatever. And especially in Tombstone, people were shocked that there was a gunfight at the OK Corral. Not that Tombstone had not experienced any violence, that other towns on the frontier had not experienced any violence. But the idea that I mean, Tombstone had billed itself as the San Francisco of the Southwest. It was looking to be a very progressive, modern, let's look forward to the 20th century kind of city on the frontier. And the idea that 8 men would crowd into a vacant lot and start shooting their guns at each other and to trying to kill each other was shocking. Like, we're past that at this point in October 1881. So it turned out they weren't past that. But it was by that point, certainly, it was uncommon to have anything like this kind of shootout.
I'm curious to know that, this trilogy that you mentioned, this kind of, that kind of happened in some ways by accident, has kind of pushed you into this Western area, but you did write this great book on Red Cloud.
Yeah.
I don't know what, 10 years ago, I don't know, whenever that was.
13 came out.
Yeah. And obviously you touched on some of that flavor with that book. But a lot of your books have been about, I don't know, 4 or 5 books on baseball, right? You've covered
Baseball.
Roger Maris, Gil Hodges, DiMaggio, Ted Williams. You've written books on all these guys.
Right.
Do you see that you kind of get into like clusters of interest, where you kind of really get into a thing for a while and then put a lot into it and then move on to the next thing? Like, are you going to go back to baseball at some point?
I'd love to. I don't have a baseball book on the horizon right now. I think it's 2 things. One is that I've had the great good fortune to be able to write and publish books about subjects that interest me. And American history interests me, baseball and golf interests me. So I've also written a couple of 2-3 books on golf. I did write baseball books on Roger Maris, Gil Hodges. I did one with Dick Enberg on Ted Williams that came out a couple of years ago. And I've done also books that deal with World War II. I mean, Lucky 666, Halsey's Typhoon, Last Stand of Fox Company with Bob Drury, was about this Korean War company. And then a bunch of years later, I got to write a book called Reckless, which is about a horse that joined the U.S. Marine Corps and fought in Korea. You heard that right. A horse that joined the Marine Corps and fought in Korea. So
let you do whatever the hell you want, basically, is what you're saying.
I mean, I know how I'm very humble that I know how blessed I am, but it's not that it happened overnight. I remember somebody when the heart of everything that is made the New York Times bestseller list and actually stayed there for quite some time. And I ran into somebody I vaguely know who said, "How does it feel to be an overnight success?" And I said, "Well, it's great that I have a bestseller, but yeah, that night lasted 30 years. I worked for many years in the journalism business and newspapers and magazines. I didn't publish my first book until I was almost 40. So from the time that I published that book from 1993 to when the Heart of Everything That Is came out in 2013, okay, that's a 20-year period of writing books. I'm not complaining at all because I did get to write about subjects I'm interested in. But I am in the fortunate position that I can go from one area to another of interest to me, but I'm not going to be made guilty about it because I worked for a lot of years. Let's face it, I've had a couple of books I cared about that sank like stones, sales-wise, when they came out. So I acknowledge them. They're my fault too. I'm happy when something sells, but it's my fault if it doesn't.
Yeah. I mean, and the other thing is, this I think is close to your 20th book, or somewhere around there. Mm-hmm. Have you always been able to maintain that pacing? Are you the kind of person that always wants a project on the back burner? You always kind of have the next thing kind of boiling, or there's 3 or 4 things you're kind of always looking at?
Yeah, there's always 2 or 3 books that overlap. Mm-hmm. By overlap, I mean they're in different stages. I'm still thankfully getting a chance to talk to people about Tombstone. So I'm in the post-publishing promotion part, and interacting with readers part of Tombstone. The book after that is my next book with Bob Drury. That is in, we just finished the final page proof, so that's going to be strictly a production matter from this point on. The book after that, I just turned in the manuscript to my editor, so that phase of writing that draft is over, but there's more work to be done. And I'm embarked on the research for the book after that, which means mostly at the beginning, just read as much as I can and read and flag stuff and begin to coordinate information. I don't do this at home. I think I'm not recommending this because it can be kind of disorienting. For one thing, I'm bouncing around from different time periods. You know, I mean, there could be a point in the day where I'm making this difficult switch from like 1777 to, 1944. And I think I envy people that are content to work on one project at a time, because I think it just makes, probably makes for a more peaceful existence, that you could focus on one project, where I find I'm juggling different things. But I find I can't help it. If something interests me, I sort of jump in.
Do you think that has anything to do with the journalism background? Meaning, like, unless you work for, say, the New Yorker, where they'll give you 3 months to work on one story, you're usually covering stuff where it's coming in nonstop all the time. So you have to kind of be able to have 5 different thoughts going and, in your head. Is that training something that kind of comes from those days?
Good question, or a good point, because I worked for daily newspapers, I worked for weekly newspapers, and anybody who's listening who has worked for a weekly newspaper is familiar with the weekly newspaper business. If you're a reporter for a weekly newspaper, many times for that one issue that comes out every Wednesday or Thursday, let's say, you may have contributed anywhere from 3, 5, 7 stories. Maybe you covered 3 or 4 meetings that week. You wrote two obituaries. You wrote a feature piece about an 80-year-old who just got his pilot's license. Yes, I mean, I had that back. That's in my background. So I think that's true, that it was never quite having the luxury of working on one thing at a time. I just found that I'm stuck for life in this I wouldn't call it a rut, because I enjoy it too.
You mentioned the research period, and where you're just kind of getting the opportunity to devour books and do all that reading. We have a guest asking if you, and this kind of ties in with whether or not you're reading fiction and nonfiction, maybe about a topic. They're asking if you've read Epitaph by Mary Doria Russell, who I believe also wrote a book about Doc Holliday also.
She also wrote a book about Crazy Horse, the Lakota Sioux warrior. No. I did not, and the reason why is, if I remember correctly, Epitaph, I believe, is a novel.
Yeah.
And which I don't mean as a criticism by any means. It's just that since a big part of my goal in Tombstone is to go back to as much as possible, the factual basis of what was happening in Tombstone and the OK Corral and the Vendetta Ride and the trial of Wyatt Earp and Doc. I worried about, if I read fictional accounts, am I good enough to screen out what's not true from what's true? So maybe it's just me not having enough confidence in my brain to do that, but I avoided fiction that dealt with that period of time and Tombstone.
I do wonder, the books have a real propulsive narrative through them that does lend itself to the style of, say, fiction writing. So the storytelling tools that you use do seem to kind of come from a more narrative background. Do you think about, or I guess not, I'm sure you do, but what role does kind of pacing play when you're putting a book like this together?
I do have to say that I'm not very conscious of it when I'm writing. I do what I usually do is I write, I'll write maybe 100 pages, go back and rewrite the first 50, write another 50, rewrite the second 50. So when I'm rereading what I've written, I am conscious of, is this boring? Is it flowing? Is it interesting? does a reader, you think, want to be, am I providing information, but am I doing so in a way that somebody wants to turn the page and get to the next page? But when I'm actually writing, I think I'm just caught up in telling the story as best I can, and hopefully the pacing is like a natural ingredient to that. And also I'm fortunate in a couple of ways that my editor, for example, is someone I've worked with for years, and I trust his opinion very much. And so he'll read something, and I'll get good feedback. This isn't working. This is boring. There's too much time being taken between point A and point B. And I have an agent who I've been with for over 30 years. So I guess I'm a pretty good team player because I respect that opinion very highly too. And so I am fortunate. I don't operate in a vacuum.
One of our guests, our friend Carrie Weens, who's one of our longtime attendees for our event, so hello, Carrie, asked, in the Tombstone canon, are there any myths that are widely believed but still false, like still things that people get wrong all the time?
Well, I can think of two things right away. I won't think of more because we'll be here all night, but two things right away. One is the depiction, for example, in movies and television shows, especially movies, that the gunfight at the OK Corral was a rather drawn out affair, that it went on for quite some time, and 5, 10, 15 minutes, with people jumping behind water barrels and horses and buildings and popping up and firing at each other. And at the ending of the movie Gunfight at the OK Corral, Billy Clanton, who's portrayed by a very young Dennis Hopper, is being chased down Tombstone by Burt Lancaster's Wyatt Earp, and there's a shootout in a saloon. When in fact, the gunfight at the OK Corral was 30 shots exchanged in only 30 seconds. It was an intense firefight in a fairly confined area. So that's one thing that people might be surprised to learn. I think another thing that people might be surprised is, well, I should say surprised, but many times when the story of Tombstone is told, what's included is a supposed gunfight between Johnny Ringo, the cowboy leader Johnny Ringo, and Doc Holliday, in which Doc kills Johnny Ringo. And that never happened. I mean, that persists. Let me just put it this way. People a lot smarter than I who have done the research into this have concluded it is highly, highly unlikely that a sickly Doc Holliday in Colorado would have been able to get back down to the Tombstone area and shoot Johnny Ringo. And that's aside from the fact that Doc was a terrible pistol shot.
Yeah. So one last question from our audience is, you were talking about all the topics that you've covered in all your previous books, and it's so very wide ranging, but they're asking if there's any famous political figures you might consider doing a book on. Now, you've touched on politics in many of the books because of just the world and stuff, and a lot of people have shown up in the books, but is there anyone in that realm that you'd want to devote a whole book to?
I don't think so. The politics of it doesn't interest. Let me put it this way. I would love to write a book about the election of 1876. And there's a very good novel by Gore Vidal that came out probably 30 years ago called 1876. But I think that in light of how fractured politics are today, whatever side of the spectrum you're on, you're concerned about where our political divide, how wide it might get. You have in 1876 an election in which to succeed Ulysses Grant in office, in which I believe was the first time that the person who won the popular vote was not elected president. I think that was Theodore Conklin from New York. And you also had federal troops in the South who were basically vote to suppress the vote. So I think that rather than one particular political figure, I would love to write a book about that particular. I'm not saying it's never been done by anybody, But that I would like to take a fresh look at that. But no, I can't think of a president that I would. I think the presidents who really interest me, people who are better writers than I have and better historians, have already done those people very, very well.
Now that you've done this book and Dodge City and Wild Bill, do you feel like you've kind of gotten it out of your system? Are you, you talked about all the other things. Is it hard to let go when you've spent so much time in a place? Does it feel, because you get to kind of know these people. What's it like kind of letting it go a little bit?
Well, I think in this particular case, because it turned into a trilogy, there's some relief in having and moving to turning my attention to a very different couple of kinds of stories. And I think ultimately, if I do return to post-Civil War or American West or American frontier, I'd like to think I'd be refreshed. Let me take a break from it. Let me work on a couple of those stories. And I may never return to it, but if I do think that sort of hiatus will do me a favor, because instead of saying, okay, well, I've done 3 books in a row, I guess number 4, I got to find a fresh way to tell this story. I'd like to think I'm going to embrace it and saying, all right, my batteries are recharged. I know I can think of a fresh way to tell the story.
Just before we wrap up with a couple of questions, I want to remind our guests, we have a link here in the chat. You can get a copy of Tombstone. I would just highly encourage you to read it. It's just a great, fun, interesting read that you're going to have a great time with, and all your friends are going to want to borrow it, but you'll just have to tell them to buy their own copy. So I wonder, one of the fun things I love about books like this is you get the opportunity as the author to take the characters we all know or think we know and highlight them, but you also get to bring people into the light that played major roles that we have no idea about. Who do you think kind of is the star of the book that people will get to know for the first time or may not know, or a couple of people that you were excited to give a little spotlight to?
Well, I think people are going to know Virgil Earp a little better. So it's that Wyatt does not take all the oxygen out of this book. I think that there are 2 characters who I really enjoyed writing about. They're not major characters in the book, but they're important characters. They're important characters in the book and also to me as a researcher. One was George Parsons. And he is a young ambitious man who wanted to be successful as a businessman in Tombstone. And he was a very disciplined journal keeper. And to read his journals he was an incessant journal writer. So you have his eyewitness accounts of what was taking place in 1880, 1881, as the tensions were building up, the characters were interacting. It's like having, he's constantly looking out the window, what's going on in Tombstone, and writing about it. And it brings us, is handed all the way down to 2020. And the other one in a similar vein is Clara Brown. Nobody knew who the heck Clara Brown was in 1880. She had come out to Tombstone to rejoin her husband who had gotten a job there. But she had ambitions to be a reporter, a journalist. And she started writing about the events in Tombstone as she saw them and experienced them, and writing these dispatches back to friends in San Diego, and they were published by the San Diego newspaper. And she was encouraged to keep writing, and she did. And lively and very enjoyable pieces to read now, that the collections of these pieces. And Clara Brown later went on from Tombstone to become one of the most pioneering female journalists in America, a long career as a newspaper and magazine writer.
My last question is this: we've all been quarantined and staying at home, but we're looking for things to do, and road trips are happening because we're not flying anywhere and things like that. We're only a few hours, 4.5 hours away from Dodge City here in Tulsa. Is it worth taking a road trip to Dodge City to visit it if we've never been there before?
Well, I would say yes for 2 reasons. One is that Dodge City itself, people might want it. I mean, Dodge City is not the Dodge City of 1875 by any means. It's a 2020 city these days. I mean, I believe the primary employer in Dodge City is a meatpacking plant. So it's not like you're going to, I mean, they do some reenactments in the tourist season, or what used to be the tourist season. But the other reason is when I went to Dodge City, I love the drive. What I happened to do is I flew into Kansas City and rented a car and drove to Dodge City, which I believe was about 5.5 hours.
Yeah, that's basically almost the whole length of the state of Kansas west.
But you see the topography change rather significantly, where it gets more hilly, and it gets. I remember it getting, to me, it was greener. It was just as nothing against eastern Kansas by any means, but as you get more into western Kansas, I thought it was absolutely beautiful. And what's a remarkable sight is, and I didn't know this until I got there, is that Dodge City is considered one of the windiest cities in the United States. And you have hundreds of wind turbines all dotting the hills, like miles before you get to Dodge City. It's like this very modern kind of aspect of how we can generate energy from wind, and Dodge City, that county, is doing it. It's an amazing drive.
Yeah. Well, we all need something to go do. So you guys are going to get a copy of Tombstone, and you're going to read it, and then you're going to take a road trip to Dodge City. Just mix it up a little bit and get something new to do in your life. Tom, this was a complete pleasure. I can't thank you enough for taking the time. I wish you the best of luck with the book, and I can't wait to see what's coming up next. So thank you for taking the time to do this.
Thank you, and I hope with what's coming up next, I'll be in Tulsa next time.
Oh, that's great. Thank you to everybody for watching. Go ahead and get a copy of the book. Tell us about it. Send us a note. Tell us what you thought of it. We're excited to see what you think about Tombstone. Thanks to Tom, and you guys, everybody take care and stay safe.
Good night.
Bye-bye.